It all started with a letter tucked in my mailbox, one of those standard HOA notices printed on cheap white paper but dripping with entitlement. The letter claimed that my private water well was a violation of community guidelines. According to them, it was unauthorized infrastructure that didn't align with the visual and environmental standards of the neighborhood. That was laughable. I live on a 5-acre property on the edge of the development, with my well dug years before the HOA even existed. I'd been using that well for clean, self-supplied water long before the HOA's bylaws were even written. Yet somehow, they thought they had the right to tell me what I could or couldn't do on my own land. The first time I confronted the HOA board about the issue, they gave me smug smiles and vague answers. "It's about community safety," they said. "We have standards to uphold." I asked them to show me the clause in the covenants that mentioned anything about private wells. They couldn't. The truth was simple. They didn't like that I was self-sufficient. I wasn't relying on their overpriced, questionably managed water system. I wasn't one of their little controlled residents, and that bothered them more than they were willing to admit. I ignored the warning. I had the paperwork showing my well was legal, permitted, and maintained according to state regulations. I wasn't violating any law, county rule, or environmental policy, but ignoring them only made things worse. A month later, I noticed strangers walking around the perimeter of my land. They wore hard hats and carried clipboards, snapping pictures and pointing at the wellhead. I approached them and asked who they were. They claimed they were conducting an HOA-approved assessment. I told them to leave, and they did. But I could feel it. Something was coming. Then one morning I woke up to the sound of machinery, grinding, rumbling, unfamiliar. I stepped outside and saw a cement truck parked in my driveway. 2 workers stood near my well, one of them holding a hose snaked into the opening. I ran out there, shouting, asking what the hell they thought they were doing. They told me they were executing a compliance order from the HOA. That's when I realized how far the board was willing to go. By the time I stopped them, it was too late. Wet concrete already filled the upper chamber of the well. My water supply, ruined. The wellhead, sealed shut with hardening cement. They had taken it upon themselves to destroy something I owned, something essential, something deeply personal. It wasn't just an act of compliance enforcement. It was an attack. A petty, calculated move meant to force me into their system and strip away my independence. I stood there, stunned, as the workers packed up and left. I called the HOA immediately, and after several transfers and voicemails, I finally reached the board president. She had the nerve to say, "We tried to give you chances to comply. You left us no choice." No choice. They made every choice. They chose to trespass. They chose to vandalize my property. They chose to believe they had more authority than the law. I knew right then that I had to do something, not just for myself, but to set a precedent. Because if they could destroy my well without consequence, what would stop them from digging up gardens, tearing down fences, or seizing sheds next? The HOA was operating like a private dictatorship, hiding behind fine print and phony regulations to bully people into submission. I reviewed every document I had. County records, permits, well logs, dated inspections. My case was airtight. I even had the original approval from the state when the well was first drilled. They had no right, no jurisdiction, and certainly no moral standing to interfere. They counted on me being isolated, quiet, afraid. But what they didn't count on was my connections and my patience running out. The sight of concrete oozing into the opening of my well is something I'll never forget. It was early morning, the kind of day where you expect a calm cup of coffee, maybe the sound of birds. Instead, I was greeted by the roar of machinery and the hiss of a cement mixer's chute unraveling like a snake. 2 men I had never seen before stood over my private well, feeding the hose into it with robotic precision. They didn't even look up when I stepped out onto my porch. They just kept working as if they were on a schedule, like this had all been planned long in advance. I shouted, demanded to know who they were and what they were doing. One of them finally turned and said, flatly, "We're here on an HOA compliance order." That phrase alone sent a wave of anger through me. My well, completely legal, documented, maintained, and personally funded, was being destroyed on the whim of a board I never voted for. There had been no court order, no environmental assessment, not even a follow-up letter after their original bogus violation notice. Just this sudden, unannounced attack. I ran over, trying to stop them, but they were already too far along. The thick slurry of wet concrete was pouring into the casing, seeping down into the chamber I had paid thousands to dig and maintain. This wasn't just a casual warning shot. This was destruction. This was theft. This was sabotage. I yelled at the driver to shut off the pump. He refused, said he was instructed not to stop once the pour began, that I need to take it up with the HOA. The nerve of it all, the confidence with which they believed they could destroy my property and face no consequences, was astounding. I felt helpless in that moment, standing in my own yard, watching my independence being buried under 3,000 pounds of quickset cement. Every dollar I had spent on the drilling, the filtration system, the permits, every ounce of effort to live sustainably, to avoid relying on the HOA's overpriced municipal water, was being erased in real time. And the worst part was, they did it because they thought they could get away with it. They thought no one would fight back. Once the truck was gone and the workers had packed up like nothing had happened, I inspected the damage. The well cap had been covered, the access pipe filled to the top. I tried to run the pump from my pressure tank, just in case, but the motor whined and gave out immediately. It was done. My water supply, the one thing that made my property truly self-reliant, had been rendered useless. The implications weren't just personal inconvenience. I had livestock that relied on that well. My garden was irrigated from it. My household water, drinking, bathing, cooking, was entirely dependent on that system. With one act, they had turned my home into a dry shell. They didn't just violate some abstract principle. They jeopardized my day-to-day survival. And for what? Because the sight of a well cap didn't match their vision of a harmonious neighborhood. Because they were afraid others might start becoming independent too? What struck me as even more outrageous was the way they went about it. No court process, no arbitration, no communication. They simply hired a third-party contractor, gave them my address, and let them loose on my land. That level of audacity doesn't come from confidence in their rightness. It comes from habit. A habit of bullying, of playing kingmaker with people's property and livelihoods. And I knew then that if this was happening to me, it had probably happened to others too, just quieter cases, people who didn't want to fight or couldn't. I began documenting everything immediately. I took photos of the hardened concrete, the damaged casing, the tire tracks from the truck. I pulled up the blueprints and permits again, proof that my well predated the HOA's very existence. I gathered past communications, letters, even emails where they admitted I was non-compliant simply because I hadn't switched to the HOA water line. All of it pointed to a premeditated act of aggression, disguised as enforcement. I realized then that this wasn't just about them thinking I had broken a rule. It was about power. The HOA board had taken it upon themselves to make an example out of me, to show everyone else in the community what happens when you choose to live by your own rules, when you reject their services, when you don't bend the knee. They filled my well with concrete, not to solve a problem, but to send a message. When I received the original violation notice, I assumed it was just another overreach, a strongly worded letter meant to intimidate me into compliance. That's how the HOA usually operated. Warnings first, then fines, then threats of legal action that rarely amounted to anything. But what happened next went beyond anything I could have imagined. The HOA didn't bother with any due process. They didn't follow up, call a meeting, or give me a fair hearing. Instead, they jumped straight to destruction, acting as if my land belonged to them. The entire process lacked any transparency or accountability, and by the time I realized what they had done, the damage was irreversible. There was no knock at the door, no phone call to confirm. Just the sound of a cement truck in my driveway, and two men working like they had every right to be there. When I asked them who gave them permission, they confidently pointed to a clipboard with a printed HOA work order attached. Not a city permit, not a judge's order, just a flimsy sheet of paper with an HOA letterhead, as if that somehow made it legal to destroy personal property. I was dumbfounded that something so serious could be authorized with nothing more than an internal memo from a board of volunteers with no real legal authority. The board never held a vote with the homeowners. There were no public minutes showing this action was discussed. In fact, the HOA's own bylaws didn't contain a single clause granting them permission to tamper with utilities or private water systems on individually owned lots. But they did it anyway, using their supposed power as justification for a completely lawless act. It was clear they believed their rules were above the law, that they could redefine property lines and ownership rights with a pen stroke and a contractor. I later found out the president of the HOA had spearheaded the initiative to eliminate unsanctioned wells throughout the neighborhood. She believed they undermined the community's image and consistency. That word, consistency, kept coming up. They wanted every home connected to the same municipal water system, billed through the HOA's preferred vendor, at rates suspiciously higher than the city average. It wasn't about safety or aesthetics or environmental concerns. It was about control. It was about forcing every resident to be part of their closed loop, where they set the prices, managed the services, and punished those who opted out. I reviewed the timeline carefully. The original notice had been delivered just 3 weeks before they took action. No formal citación. No opportunity to contest it. No professional inspection of the well. They hadn't tested the water or cited any legitimate hazard. I even contacted the county health department to ask if there had been any complaints or notices filed against my property. There were none. The HOA had acted completely on its own, based on an internal opinion, without coordination with any official body. They had bypassed every check and balance that normally protects a homeowner from abuse. When I tried to confront the board at their next meeting, I wasn't even allowed to speak. They moved the discussion behind closed doors, citing legal sensitivity. The moment I tried to raise my hand and ask questions, the meeting was adjourned. It was clear they weren't interested in dialogue. They were trying to bury the issue, figuratively and literally. My well wasn't just filled with concrete. My voice had been silenced too. They hoped I would simply go away, quietly reconnect to their water line, and fall back in a line like everyone else. The arrogance of their decision was staggering. They didn't fear consequences because they believed their position protected them. HOA boards often operate in this gray area, quasi-legal entities that act like governments but without any of the legal safeguards. They fine people for fence colors, yard decorations, parking spots, but this was different. This was the willful destruction of essential infrastructure, and they treated it like a routine action, no different from issuing a citation for weeds in a flower bed. As I dug deeper into their actions, I discovered that this wasn't the first time they had taken matters into their own hands. Another neighbor had a rainwater collection system forcibly dismantled. Someone else had their garden beds ripped out because they weren't aesthetically uniform. But those people didn't fight back. They didn't know how, or they were too worn down to try. I wasn't going to be the next silent casualty. What the HOA had done to me wasn't just an overstep. It was a violation of my property rights, my autonomy, and basic principles of due process. The HOA made one fatal mistake. They assumed I was just another isolated homeowner with no influence beyond my property line. They thought they could pour concrete into my well, erase my independence, and leave me scrambling without consequence. What they didn't realize is that I wasn't just another resident. My family had deep ties to the local water district, and I personally held a board advisory position with the Regional Water Authority. While the HOA was busy flexing its imaginary authority, they had no idea I was sitting on real power, the kind that comes with legal access, regulatory oversight, and infrastructure control. I had kept a low profile for years. I paid my dues, avoided the meetings, stayed off their radar. My well existed quietly on my land, fully permitted, inspected annually, and functioning better than the HOA-managed system that regularly left people with brown water and inflated bills. I never wanted to flaunt my position. My role at the water district was about ensuring safe and equitable service, not pulling strings for personal gain. But once they crossed the line, once they filled my well with concrete and treated it like a disciplinary act, it became clear I had to use every resource available to defend my rights and stop their abuse. The moment the cement hardened, I initiated contact with the regulatory branch of the Water Authority. I wasn't calling as a homeowner. I was calling as someone with insider knowledge, jurisdictional awareness, and direct lines to the Compliance and Enforcement Division. I explained the situation in precise terms, citing chapter and verse from the municipal codes they violated. Tampering with a permitted water source isn't just unethical, it's illegal. The HOA had authorized unlicensed third parties to disable a legally protected utility, potentially endangering my health and property. That's not just an overstep. It's a liability nightmare. I sent over documentation, permits, well logs, the original state license number, and recent inspections. I provided photographic evidence of the sabotage, including the mixer truck, the poor site, and the damage done. Within days, my report triggered a formal inquiry. The Water Authority opened a case file, and an investigator was assigned to look into the HOA's actions. Because of my connections, the process moved faster than usual. I wasn't just another voice in a stack of complaints. I was someone they already knew and trusted and understood to be serious about water rights and landowner protections. At the same time, I pulled records from the HOA's service provider. It turns out the HOA didn't manage the water directly. They merely brokered it through a third-party municipal contractor. That contractor, under state agreement, reported to the same water district I worked with. And under regional policy, any significant infrastructure change, especially one affecting water delivery, requires approval from the board. No such approval had ever been requested. No notices filed. No inspections completed. The HOA had not only acted outside their authority, they had failed to notify the very system they were supposedly a part of. I met with the district administrator in person, walking them through what had happened. They were shocked, not just by the act itself, but by the precedent it could set. If an HOA could destroy a private well without consequence, what would stop others from doing the same? The administrator agreed that the incident couldn't be ignored. We discussed jurisdiction, enforcement options, and the possibility of suspending the HOA's contract with a municipal provider until a full review could be completed. I knew then that the board had no idea what they had triggered. The truth is, HOA power is limited to what residents allow. They operate with the illusion of control, often unchallenged because homeowners are either unaware of their rights or too exhausted to fight. But in this case, they had picked the wrong person. They hadn't just attacked a homeowner. They had interfered with a recognized, legally documented water system governed under state law. That gave me standing. That gave the water district cause. And it gave me the tools to respond not emotionally, but strategically and legally. As word spread through the Water Authority, colleagues and officials who had worked with me in the past reached out. Many of them had their own horror stories about HOAs mismanaging water access, restricting well use, or pushing predatory water contracts on communities with no choice. My situation was far from unique. It was just better documented, better defended, and positioned at the right intersection of policy and power. It took one phone call, just one, to change everything. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I simply presented the facts to the right person at the right office. Within minutes, the gears of the Regional Water Authority were in motion. The HOA had crossed into territory far beyond their pay grade. They thought they were playing a local game, flexing minor power over fences, lawns, and trash bins. What they didn't understand was that tampering with water infrastructure opened a whole new level of scrutiny, one they weren't prepared for and couldn't control. The call I made was to the district operations director, someone I had worked with professionally for years. I laid out exactly what had happened. A private, legally registered water well had been sabotaged by an HOA under the pretense of noncompliance, with no regulatory documentation, no permits, and no environmental assessment. The moment I described the unauthorized use of concrete in a water source, I heard the tone on the other end shift. This wasn't just a violation of homeowner rights. It was potentially a violation of multiple state water safety regulations. The director immediately ordered a compliance review. The HOA's water supply system, while managed through a contracted municipal provider, still depended on regional coordination for sourcing, quality control, and delivery flow. The water district had the authority to suspend or reroute water service to any community under investigation for mismanagement or misconduct. And in this case, the district had reason to believe the HOA had not only overstepped their bounds, but also posed a contamination risk. Their reckless decision to fill a well with concrete, without knowing if it connected to subsurface aquifers or shared pressure systems, was enough to trigger emergency protocol. Within hours of the call, the regional team issued a temporary freeze on all non-essential water flow to the HOA. This wasn't a full shutdown at first. It started with a system pressure reduction, which immediately affected outdoor sprinklers, fountains, and shared irrigation systems. Residents began noticing that their lawns weren't being watered. Community landscaping turned dry. Decorative ponds went stagnant. Then came the restriction notices. Water usage limits were placed on each household, with fines attached for overuse. Suddenly, the same HOA that tried to force me into their system was scrambling to explain to their residents why everyone's water privileges were vanishing overnight. By day 2, the board was in full panic mode. Emails flew across the community, trying to shift blame onto the service provider. They told residents the city was at fault. They claimed a system upgrade had caused the interruption. But I knew, and the district knew, that it wasn't an accident. It was a response. Every step they took to hide it only made things worse. When they tried to bypass the restrictions by contracting emergency water delivery for their clubhouse and shared amenities, the district stepped in again and blocked the authorization. They were caught, and they knew it. The board called an emergency meeting. This time, they couldn't keep it private. Too many people were asking questions, and too many of them knew my story now. Neighbors started knocking on my door, not with complaints, but with support. They asked me what had really happened. I showed them the evidence, the before and after photos, the permits, the emails. I explained how the HOA had acted illegally and why the district responded the way it did. More and more residents began attending the meetings, demanding answers, demanding accountability. The same board members who once ignored my concerns were now being forced to listen. The HOA tried to file an appeal with the water district, but they were told the investigation had to run its course. That meant restrictions stayed in place, and every move the board made was monitored. Daily reports were sent from the district's compliance division, tracking usage, pressure, and leak points. The board could no longer make unilateral decisions without clearance. Their ability to control and coerce was crumbling with every gallon of water they could no longer guarantee. People who had once stayed silent out of fear were now finding their voices. Some residents began pulling their financial records, looking into how the HOA managed water contracts and service bills. Others started demanding a full audit. What began as one call turned into a ripple effect that shook the foundation of the HOA's control. Their illusion of power was breaking, exposed for the bureaucracy it really was. And they couldn't stop it, because the very system they had tried to force me into now stood firmly against them. It didn't take long before the full consequences of the HOA's actions came crashing down on them. The moment the water restrictions went into effect, the board found themselves overwhelmed, not just by legal inquiries from the water district, but by furious residents whose daily lives were suddenly disrupted. Calls started pouring in, inboxes filled with complaints, and homeowners who once blindly trusted the HOA began demanding answers. People wanted to know why they couldn't water their lawns, why their showers sputtered, why their children couldn't fill a pool on a summer day. The board tried to deflect, but the truth couldn't be contained anymore. Word spread fast. Within days, the story of what happened to my well and how I responded became public knowledge across the neighborhood. The photos I had taken of the cement filled, while circulated through community group chats and private Facebook groups. My permit documents, emails, and official correspondence with the water district served as undeniable evidence. Residents who had once dismissed HOA drama as minor annoyances suddenly realized how serious and reckless the board's actions had been. They understood that this wasn't just about one homeowner, it was about all of them. If the HOA could do that to me, they could do it to anyone. Neighbors who had once been neutral now stood behind me. Some even admitted they had quietly dealt with the HOA's abuse before, being fined for paint colors, forced to remove sheds, ordered to replace mailboxes. But until now, no one had seen the board get pushed back. Now they had, and they wanted more. Community meetings became louder, angrier, more organized. Residents demanded to see financial records, emails, the work order that authorized the cement truck, anything that could explain how such a destructive act was even possible. The board, previously smug and dismissive, now fumbled under pressure, scrambling to justify their actions. At the center of it all was the water, the one thing no one could live without. The HOA had targeted me by destroying my private source of water, thinking it would force me to comply. Instead, they had triggered a chain reaction that led to them losing control over the entire community supply. Their tactics, once quiet and manipulative, had now backfired in the loudest way possible. No one could ignore the dry lawns, the limited showers, the new water bills showing penalties and surcharges. Every drop missing from a faucet reminded residents of the board's arrogance and failure. Eventually, members of the board reached out to me directly. Not to apologize, at least not at first, but to negotiate. They wanted the water flow restored. They asked if I could help de-escalate the situation. They talked about misunderstandings, miscommunications, and overzealous decisions. But I wasn't interested in vague explanations or hollow language. I had done everything by the book. They were the ones who bypassed legal protocol, trespassed on my land, and destroyed property they didn't own. If they wanted the water back, it wouldn't be on their terms anymore. Residents who once nodded quietly at meetings began calling for resignations. A recall petition started circulating. Some homeowners with legal backgrounds started looking into whether the HOA's insurance policy even covered what they had done. The entire neighborhood turned from passive compliance to active resistance, and it all stemmed from a simple truth that the board had gone too far. They had tried to punish independence and ended up exposing their own vulnerability. What they never expected was to find themselves on the receiving end of the very desperation they had tried to create for me. When the board came back to me again, this time softer, more careful, they asked what could be done to resolve the matter. They asked if I could speak to the water district, explain that it was a mistake, help get the restrictions lifted. It was almost surreal, watching the people who had once dismissed my concerns now pleading for relief. I didn't need to say much. The water district was already conducting a full investigation, and their findings would speak louder than I ever could. The HOA had acted without permits, violated environmental regulations, and jeopardized an entire community's access to a critical utility. They had broken trust and failed their duties, not just with me, but with everyone who lived under their governance. That was no longer just a personal issue. It was a structural failure they couldn't spin or silence. The neighborhood had seen it all, and no one would forget who was responsible.